She said it in front of 40 people holding champagne glasses. I don't have time to babysit a dying old man's chemo schedule, Dad. This isn't exactly the family story I want people telling at my anniversary party. For a second, nobody moved. The string quartet in the corner kept playing, 3 bars of something light and classical, that didn't know yet that it had become the soundtrack to the worst thing my daughter had ever said to me. And somewhere behind me I heard a single ice cube shift and settle in someone's glass, that small clean click of it, and then nothing else. No cough, no shuffle of shoes on the marble. 40 adults standing completely still, the way a room goes still right before a held breath becomes visible. I looked at my daughter Vanessa in her cream-colored dress that cost more than I made restoring a Seth Thomas Mantel clock, and I thought, I am a stopped clock to her now, not broken. Worse than broken. Just something nobody bothers to wind anymore. My name is Walter Brennan. I'm 62 years old, and for 38 years I have made my living taking apart things that other people have given up on and making them run true again. I restore antique clocks and pocket watches out of a narrow storefront on Vine Street in Cincinnati that my father opened in 1961 and that I inherited along with his tools, his debts, and his stubborn belief that a thing built with enough patience will always, eventually, tell the truth. Brennan's time, the sign says, hand-lettered gold on black, and under it a smaller line my father added when I was 19 years old and impatient with everything. Every second accounted for. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now better than I've ever understood anything. I want to tell you about my daughter, and about the 2 years that came before that anniversary party, and about what I did in the 11 months after it. But to understand any of it, you need to understand the thing I've never told anyone outside this shop, not even the man I'm about to introduce you to. There is a sound that stops me cold every single time, no matter where I am or what I'm doing. It's the specific descending chime of a Westminster quarter-hour strike, the one you hear in old hallway clocks and church towers, 4 notes falling like something giving up. My wife Margaret died in a hospital corridor that had one of those clocks bolted to the wall across from the ICU waiting room, an ugly commercial thing nobody had serviced in years, half a beat slow, and I sat under it for 11 days, listening to it announce every quarter hour of her dying with that same tired falling phrase. Now, if I'm in a shop and a customer's clock strikes that same 4-note fall, my hands stop moving. Not shaking, stopping. Dead still, mid-motion, however long it takes for the sound to finish. I've learned to turn away from customers when it happens so they don't see my face. I've had 3 different Westminster movements sitting in my back room for over a year because I cannot make myself wind them up to test the repair. That is the truth about me that nobody in my family knows because I have never let them see it. A man who fixes clocks for a living, afraid of a clock. There's a joke in there somewhere, but I've never been able to find the funny part of it. Margaret and I were married 34 years before the cancer took her. Hers was ovarian. Mine came 4 years after, a different thief with a similar method, pancreatic, stage 2, when they found it, which the oncologist told me, not unkindly, was better luck than most people get with that particular diagnosis. I didn't tell Vanessa right away. I want to be honest about that, because it matters to what happened later. I sat on it for 3 weeks, turning it over the way I'd turn over a movement I didn't yet understand, looking for the actual shape of the problem before I said anything to anybody. When I finally called her, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she asked the right questions, stage, treatment plan, prognosis, and for about 2 months she was the daughter I'd raised. She came to 2 of the early appointments. She brought soup she'd clearly bought from the deli around the corner from her office and repackaged into a container from home, which was such a small, transparent human thing to do, that it made me love her more, not less. I want you to understand that I am not telling you a story about a daughter who was always cruel. I am telling you about a daughter who was, for most of her life, genuinely good, and about what happened to her somewhere in the 2nd year of my treatment, when the chemo schedule collided head-on with her husband's business and her own ambitions in a way that revealed something about her I had spent 30 years refusing to look at directly. Her husband's name is Marcus Cole. He's a real estate developer, or he presents himself as one, the kind of man who says portfolio the way other men say Telbox, like it's a thing he actually built with his hands instead of a phrase he learned at a conference. Vanessa met him 9 years ago at a law firm mixer. She's an attorney, corporate litigation, sharp enough that I've watched her take apart an argument in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of watching myself take apart a movement, looking for the one bent tooth that's throwing off the whole gear train. Marcus was polished in the specific way that makes you suspicious before you can articulate why. Firm handshake. Direct eye contact held a half-second too long, like he'd read somewhere that eye contact conveys confidence and had simply increased the dosage. Margaret liked him fine. I never fully did, and when Margaret asked me why, in the last year of her own life, sitting up in bed with a blanket over her knees even in July, because the chemo had stolen her ability to stay warm, I told her the truth. He talks like a man measuring the room for its resale value. She laughed at that, the real laugh, and said, "Walter, everybody measures rooms. Some people are just less polite about hiding it." I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the 2 years since. The trouble with Marcus wasn't obvious for a long time because Marcus is not a stupid man, and stupid men are the only kind whose trouble announces itself early. What I noticed instead, over those 9 years, in small pieces, was a pattern of Vanessa becoming quieter around money. Not poorer, quieter. She stopped mentioning specific numbers the way she used to when she was younger and proud of her own paycheck. She started deflecting questions about their house, their cars, a boat Marcus bought 2 summers ago that he referred to at every family gathering as the little escape, as though 38 feet of fiberglass and twin outboard engines were a modest thing a person might overlook. I noticed that Vanessa handled the check at restaurants with a speed that read less like generosity and more like management, the way you move quickly to close a door before someone smells the smoke on the other side of it. I noticed all of this the way I notice a watch that's running fast, not because anything is visibly wrong, but because the tick has a rhythm to it that experience tells you not to trust. My diagnosis came in March, 2 years before that anniversary party. The first 6 months were the hard chemo, the kind that takes a man apart from the inside and leaves him folded over a bathroom floor at 3 in the morning, with nobody there to see it, because Margaret was gone, and I had never in 38 years of marriage learned how to ask anyone else for help. I want to be fair to Vanessa about those first 6 months, because she showed up. She drove me to 4 appointments herself. She sat in the ugly vinyl chairs of the infusion center with her laptop open, working through her lunch hour, but present, her knee occasionally bumping mine, which from Vanessa is practically an embrace. It was in month 7 that things began to change, and I noticed the exact week it happened because I keep a ledger, an actual physical ledger, the way my father did, the way I've done since I was 22 years old. Every appointment, every symptom, every phone call, logged in a hand, I'm told, looks like my father's, cramped and precise. The week Vanessa's visit stopped was the same week she mentioned, almost in passing, over a phone call I'd initiated because she hadn't called in 9 days, that Marcus's firm was going through a stretch. She used that exact phrase. A stretch. The way you describe traffic, not the specific gray tone that had crept into her voice, the tone of someone reciting a line she'd been given rather than a fact she'd arrived at herself. I didn't push. That has always been my failure and my discipline both. I don't pull a movement apart on a hunch. I wait for the diagnostic to confirm what the hunch is telling me. So I waited through month 8, when she missed 3 appointments in a row and sent a text, instead of calling, through month 9, when she didn't come to the appointment where the oncologist first used the word shrinking about the tumor, a word I had waited 9 months to hear and heard alone in a paper gown with my phone in my lap, showing no missed calls, through month 10, when I called to tell her the good news and she picked up already mid-conversation, with someone else in her office, said, "That's great, Dad. Hey, can I call you back?" and did not call back for 4 days. By month 11, I had stopped expecting her at appointments and started, without fully admitting it to myself, expecting her absence the way you expect a part you know is warned to eventually fail. There was a man who filled the space she left, and I want to introduce him now because he matters more to what happens later in this story than almost anyone else in it. His name is Desmond Okafor, and he is 26 years old. And 4 years ago, he walked into my shop off Vine Street with a broken pocket watch his late grandfather had carried through 2 tours in the army, and asked me, with an intensity that startled me, whether it could be saved. It could. It took me 3 weeks, and I refused to let him pay me for it, and instead of leaving satisfied, he came back the following Saturday and asked if I needed help sweeping up. I did not need help sweeping up. I let him sweep up anyway. Over 4 years, Desmond has become the closest thing I have to an apprentice, though I never formally offered him the title and he never formally asked for it. It simply happened the way rust happens, slow and constant, until one day you look up and the whole surface has changed. He works a full-time job doing IT support at a hospital system across the river, and he comes to my shop 3 evenings a week and every Saturday, unpaid, because he says fixing things that other people call unfixable is the only part of his week that feels like it matters. During the worst of my chemo, when I could not stand for long stretches at the bench, Desmond started coming 5 evenings a week instead of 3, and he never once asked me why, and he never once told anyone else what he was doing. And when I finally worked up the nerve, in month 9, to tell him I had cancer, a fact I had not yet told most of my own extended family, he set down the mainspring he was winding, walked around the bench, and put both arms around me. I want to describe this precisely because it is not something either of us does. Desmond Okafor and I are men who communicate primarily through the careful, wordless language of tools, passed hand to hand across a workbench. We had never embraced in 4 years of knowing each other. He held on for what felt like a full minute, and I felt something in my chest that had been wound too tight for longer than I wanted to admit finally give a quarter turn of slack. And neither of us said anything about it afterward, and neither of us has needed to since the anniversary party where Vanessa said what she said was Marcus's idea, a lavish 10-year celebration at a rented event space downtown with a view of the river, the kind of thing that costs more than my father made restoring clocks in an entire year of his life. I almost didn't go. My last infusion had been 4 days earlier, and my body still felt like something poorly reassembled, gears meshing at the wrong tension, but Vanessa had actually called, her own voice, for the first time in 3 weeks, and asked me to come, and some part of me, the part that still believed the daughter from month 1 through 6 was the true and permanent shape of her, said yes before I'd fully thought it through. I stood near the edge of that room in a jacket that used to fit better before the chemo took 30 pounds off me, watching my daughter laugh at something. One of Marcus's business partners said, watching Marcus work the room with his portfolio measuring eyes, and at some point during a lull in the music I made the mistake of mentioning, quietly, to Vanessa, that I had a follow-up scan the following Tuesday and I hadn't been able to find anyone to drive me, that Desmond had offered, but he had a work commitment that day, and could she possibly? That's when she said it, in front of 40 people, loud enough to carry, the way a voice carries when the person saying it has stopped fully registering an audience, or perhaps has started performing for one. I didn't argue. I want you to understand that about me before we go any further into this story, because everything that happened afterward depended on it. I have never in my life raised my voice in anger and won anything by doing it. What I did instead, standing in that rented room with the string quartet, finding their way back into the piece they'd been playing, was give my daughter a slow, small nod, set my untouched champagne glass down on the nearest table, and walk out. Nobody stopped me. I heard, behind me, Marcus's voice picking up the slack, the way you'd throw a tarp over something you didn't want people looking at directly. Too loud, too fast, some story about a property deal that nobody in that room actually wanted to hear. I drove myself home. My hands were steady on the wheel the entire way, which surprised me, because everything else in me had gone very quiet, in a way I recognized from 38 years of watching springs release their tension. Not a snap. Not a break, just a long, controlled uncoiling toward a new resting position. I sat in my workshop that night for 4 hours without turning on a single light except the small gooseneck lamp over my bench. I did not cry, though I want to be honest that I came close twice, close enough that I had to set down the tools in my hands and simply sit with my palms flat on the worn oak surface of a bench that had held my father's hands and then mine for 60 years. What I did instead of crying was think the way I think through a repair I don't yet understand, not the angry loop, not replaying the sentence over and over the way rage wants you to, but the diagnostic loop, the one that asks, what do I actually know? What I knew was this. I knew my daughter had called me a dying old man in front of 40 strangers rather than admit that driving her father to a cancer scan was inconvenient to her schedule. I knew that inconvenient to her schedule had, over 11 months, replaced every other explanation I generously supplied for her absence. And I knew, sitting there in the near dark with my father's tools laid out in their felt-lined drawers around me, that I had a decision in front of me that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with the kind of clarity that only arrives once you stop asking a broken thing to please, somehow, still be what you need it to be. 3 days later, I called my attorney, a woman named Priscilla Vance, who had handled the estate paperwork after Margaret died, and who had, in the 2 years since, become something closer to a friend than a professional contact. I sat in her office on a Thursday morning in a chair that smelled faintly of old leather and told her I wanted to redraft my will and my trust and every beneficiary designation attached to every account I owned. She asked me, in the careful, neutral tone attorneys use when they suspect there's a story behind a request, but know better than to ask for it directly, whether I wanted to talk through my reasoning. I told her only this. My daughter told me, in front of 40 people, that she didn't have time to babysit a dying old man. Priscilla Vance set down her pen, looked at me for a long moment, and said, Walter, I'm very sorry. Let's talk about what you actually want the next chapter of this to look like. That afternoon, I began the process of removing Vanessa Cole as primary beneficiary of everything I own, the shop, the modest but not insignificant investment accounts. Margaret and I had built over 3 decades of careful frugality, a collection of restored antique timepieces that, I would learn later that year from an appraiser I hired specifically for this purpose, was worth considerably more than either Vanessa or I had ever discussed out loud. I did not act in anger. I want that understood clearly. I acted the way I have approached every difficult repair of my life. Slowly, with full documentation, checking my own reasoning twice before committing to an irreversible cut. But redrafting a will is not revenge. It is protection, and there is a difference. One my father taught me with a phrase I didn't understand until I was much older. A good repair fixes what's broken. A great repair prevents the next thing from breaking too. I wasn't finished, because 3 days after that party, on the same afternoon I sat in Priscilla Vance's office, I had also begun to notice something else. Something that had been sitting at the edge of my attention for months without my letting myself look at it directly. The shape of Marcus Cole's business, and the increasingly specific way my daughter had started talking, in the rare moments she still called me at all, about needing to get through this stretch. That's a story for the next part of this telling, because there's a great deal more to say about what a stretch actually was, about what I found when I finally let myself look at it directly, and about a small tin box I hadn't opened in 3 years that was still sitting, at that point, on the top shelf of my bedroom closet. A box that would turn out to matter more than anything Marcus Cole had ever built with someone else's money. Otto Reyes has owned the locksmith shop 2 doors down from mine on Vine Street for 26 years, and in all that time I have never once heard him raise his voice, which is part of why, when I needed someone who could ask careful questions without drawing attention to the fact that questions were being asked, he was the first person I called. Otto and I have shared a wall, a coffee pot, and most Tuesday lunches since before either of our wives passed. His to a stroke, mine to the cancer that would, 4 years later, come for me too. And there's a particular kind of friendship that survives that kind of parallel grief. The kind where neither man has to explain the weight the other one is carrying, because you've watched each other carry it. I called him on a Sunday evening, a week after the anniversary party, and asked if he had time to talk about something. About Preston. No, wait. He caught himself and laughed once, short and dry. Sorry, Walt. I've been listening to my nephew's Revenge podcast. Everybody's named Preston on that show. About Marcus, you mean? About Marcus, I confirmed. Otto was quiet for a second in the particular way he goes quiet before he tells you something he's already been sitting on. I was wondering how long it'd take you to call me about that, he said. I sat forward in my chair. You already know something. I know a little, he said. My cousin's wife does title work downtown. Closing paperwork, the boring end of real estate nobody thinks about until it goes wrong. She mentioned a few months back, not gossiping, just talking shop, the way people do, that there'd been some unusual activity on a handful of files connected to coal development, money coming into escrow that didn't line up clean with the money supposedly already invested. She said it in passing. I didn't think much of it at the time. Didn't seem like my business. He paused. Seems like it might be yours now. I want to tell you something about what it means to have spent 38 years learning a trade like mine. When you take apart enough broken machines, you develop an instinct for the particular silence that precedes a failure. The way a mainspring will run smooth right up until the exact tooth that's been quietly weakening for months finally gives, and everything downstream of it stops making sense all at once. I had that feeling now, listening to Otto, the feeling of a man standing over an open case, seeing the first small sign of a much larger problem, and knowing with total certainty that if he pulled on this one loose thread, the whole mechanism was going to come apart in his hands. I need your help with this, I told him. I know, Otto said. That's why I'm not asking if you're sure. What followed took about 7 weeks, and I want to be precise about what that process actually looked like, because it was nothing like the movies make it look, and nothing sudden happened, and there was no single dramatic discovery. There was instead the same slow, patient accumulation of small verified facts that has always been the actual texture of my working life. Otto's cousin's wife, whose name was Denise and who I met exactly once, over coffee, in a diner far enough from downtown that nobody we knew would recognize either of us, was careful to only discuss what was a matter of public record, recorded liens, filed permits, the kind of paperwork any citizen can request and read if they know where to look and have the patience to read it. What that public record showed, once Otto and I had spent evenings at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, tracing the pattern of it, was a series of 4 separate commercial development projects Marcus's firm had taken investor money for over the previous 3 years, projects that, on paper, had broken ground, stalled, and then quietly folded, one after another, each time with investor capital that seemed to have gone in and simply not come back out in any form the public filings could account for. I am not a financial investigator. I want to be honest that most of what those documents said meant very little to me on first reading. Pages of terms like mezzanine financing and capital call and limited partnership interests that swam past me the way a customer's eyes swim past the words escapement and going barrel when I try to explain what's actually wrong with their grandfather's watch. What I understood, in the end, was much simpler than the paperwork made it look. Marcus had been taking money from new investors and using a portion of it to make it appear, on paper, that older investors were receiving returns on projects that were, in reality, hemorrhaging money. It is, Otto's friend Denise told me over that diner coffee, one of the oldest and least original forms of financial fraud there is, the kind that gets a paragraph in every introductory finance textbook, precisely because it works right up until someone with enough patience and no professional stake in looking away decides to actually trace the numbers to their source. It's not clever, she said, stirring her coffee slowly. It just relies on nobody bothering to check. I sat with that fact for nearly 2 weeks before I did anything further, and I want to explain why. Because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. Whatever I did next was going to land on my daughter first, before it landed on Marcus, and I was not going to be careless with her the way Marcus had apparently been careless with the people who trusted him. So I called her. I invited her to the diner where she and I used to go every Sunday morning when she was in law school. A place with bad coffee and vinyl booths that had been patched with silver tape since before she was born. And I watched her walk in, wearing a blazer that looked like it had been slept in, dark circles under her eyes, she'd covered imperfectly with concealer that had settled into the fine lines she hadn't had 2 years earlier. "How are you?" I asked her. "I'm fine, Dad. Busy." She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug the way she used to as a girl, holding it for the warmth rather than to drink from it. "How are you feeling? The scans, are they?" "Stable," I said. "We'll talk about that. First, I want to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer me instead of managing me." Something crossed her face at the word managing, a small flinch quickly smoothed over, the reflex of someone who has gotten very practiced at smoothing things over. "Okay," she said. "How are things with Marcus's business?" The pause was 2 seconds. "I know because I count. The way I've counted the beats of every escapement I've ever serviced. And 2 seconds is a very long pause in a conversation between a father and daughter who used to be able to finish each other's sentences. "We've had some stretch," she said, and there it was again, that word, stretch, worn smooth from overuse like a coin carried too long in a pocket. "Marcus says it's temporary, a liquidity thing. It's nothing we can't handle. How long has it been a stretch?" Another pause, longer this time. "About 2 years," she said quietly, and I watched something in her face give way slightly. The way a dam gives way, not all at once, but in a hairline crack that widens slowly under pressure that's been building far longer than anyone on the surface could see. 2 years. The same 2 years I had been sick. The same 2 years she had been disappearing from my chemo appointments, from my scans, from the ordinary daily texture of my illness. I felt something shift in my understanding of her in that moment. Not forgiveness, not yet. I want to be honest about that, but something closer to a diagnosis clarifying itself, the way a symptom that seemed random suddenly makes sense once you understand the actual mechanism behind it. "Elena," I started and caught myself. Because that isn't her name is Vanessa, but I want to leave that slip in this telling because it's the truth of what happened in my head in that moment. For one disorienting second, I saw not my own daughter across that vinyl booth, but every daughter, every child, anywhere, caught in the machinery of a partner's failure and too ashamed or too frightened to say so out loud. "Vanessa," I corrected myself, "I need you to listen to me carefully. I've been looking into some things. I'm not going to tell you everything today because I don't want to hand you half a picture and let you build the wrong conclusion out of it. But I need you to do one thing before we go any further." "What?" "I need you to get your own attorney, not Marcus's firm's attorney, not someone he trusts, someone with no connection to him at all, who works for you and only you." She went very still, the coffee mug frozen halfway to her mouth. "Dad, what did you find?" "I found questions that need to be answered by people with the authority to answer them properly," I said. "And I found that you need to be protected before those questions get asked in any formal way." She set the mug down with a precision I recognized. It was Margaret's precision, the exact careful way her mother used to set things down when she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. "How bad?" she said. Not a question. Exactly. A demand for the size of the thing she was about to have to carry. "I don't know the full shape of it yet," I told her honestly, "but I think you need to prepare yourself for it being significant." She nodded once, a small, controlled motion, and reached across the table to put her hand over mine, the first time she had touched me voluntarily in longer than either of us wanted to admit. "Okay," she said. "Okay." And then, after a moment, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it under the diner's ambient clatter, "Is this because of what I said at the party?" I looked at my daughter. I thought about the sound of that ice cube shifting in someone's glass. The 4 bars of string quartet music that didn't stop. The specific way a room goes quiet when it's just watched something true fall out of someone's mouth by accident. That woke me up to look harder at things I'd been letting myself ignore. I said, "But it isn't the reason, no. The reason is that a man named Marcus Cole has been taking money from people who trusted him, and I don't think you knew the size of it until it started swallowing your own marriage." She didn't argue with me. That, more than anything else in that conversation, told me how close to the surface the truth already was for her. how long she had already been quietly drowning in a thing she hadn't found the words to name out loud to anyone, maybe not even to herself. The attorney I helped her find was a woman named Renata Solis, a family and financial law specialist with 22 years of practice, who communicated from our very first phone call in the complete, unhedged sentences of someone who does not perform reassurance she isn't prepared to back up with actual competence. Vanessa called me after their first meeting and said only, "I like her," which from my daughter, in that period, was the equivalent of an embrace. I also, in that same week, reached out to a man I had met years earlier through a customer relationship that had turned into something like friendship. A retired financial crimes investigator named Harold Chin, who had, once upon a time, brought me his father's Hamilton Railroad watch to restore and had, over the 18 months it took me to source the correct parts, become someone I trusted enough to call when I needed advice I couldn't get anywhere else. I laid out everything Otto and Denise and I had traced, sitting across from Harold at his kitchen table, with the yellow legal pad between us, and when I finished he looked at me for a long moment over his glasses and said, "You understand this is going to open doors that don't close again once they're open." "That's the intention," I said. "And your daughter's protected. She has her own attorney. Nothing in her name is exposed to what's coming." He nodded slowly, picked up his coffee, and said, "All right, I know a few people who'll want to hear about this properly. What happened after that, I can only describe from the outside. The way you describe a repair someone else finished after you handed off the parts, offices I wasn't in, conversations I wasn't part of, processes that moved at the deliberate pace of institutions rather than individuals. What I know is that the information reached the people with the authority to examine it formally, and that they found it worth examining. An inquiry opened. Quiet, at first. These things are always quiet at first. The noise comes later. And by the time it comes, the man at the center of it has usually already convinced himself, right up until the moment it's too late, that quiet means safe. I sat Diana down. No. I sat with Otto that evening in my workshop, because Diana was Margaret's sister's name, and Margaret has been gone 3 years, and there is no one left in my life named Diana to sit with. Only the small tin box on the top shelf of my bedroom closet that I still had not opened, and a Westminster chime clock in my back room that I had been avoiding testing for over a year, and a daughter who was, for the first time in 11 months, calling me back within hours instead of days. I told Otto everything that had happened, everything Harold had confirmed, everything Renata Solis was now building on Vanessa's behalf, and when I finished he sat quietly for a long moment, turning his own coffee mug slowly on the table between us the way a man turns a problem over when he's decided it's worth taking seriously. "You know," he said finally, "when you first called me about this, I almost told you to let it go. Told you it wasn't worth what it was going to cost you, chasing a son-in-law's finances while you're still going through your own treatment." "Why didn't you?" "Because I've known you 26 years, Walt. And I knew you'd nod at me and say, okay, and then go do it anyway, quietly on your own. And at least this way I got to actually be useful to you instead of just being right." He shook his head slowly. "Besides, what she said to you. At that party, in front of 40 people." His jaw tightened, the closest I've ever seen Otto Reyes come to visible anger. "A person doesn't say something like that by accident. That wasn't a slip of the tongue from a tired daughter. That was 2 years of something ugly finally finding its way to the surface." "No," I agreed. "It wasn't about the chemo schedule. Not really. No," Otto said. "It was about her deciding somewhere along the way that you'd stopped being someone worth protecting. And I think," he added more gently now, "that decision had a lot less to do with you than it did with whatever Marcus Cole had been quietly doing to her for 2 years without telling her the truth about any of it." I thought about that for a long time after Otto left that night. I sat alone in my workshop with the small lamp over my bench, and eventually, for the first time in 3 years, I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, reached to the top shelf of my closet, and took down the small tin box that had sat there untouched since the week after Margaret's funeral. I did not open it that night. I set it on my nightstand instead, where I could see it, and I lay awake for a long time looking at it in the dark, understanding without yet being able to fully explain to myself why some instinct told me that whatever was inside it was going to matter more than any will, any trust, any legal document Priscilla Vance was drafting on my behalf, that the real evidence in this story, the thing that would eventually break everything open in a way no bank statement ever could, was not sitting in some accountant's file cabinet at all, but had been waiting, patiently, in a box I'd been too afraid to open, for 3 quiet years. The tin box held 11 things, and I want to tell you about all of them, because I have come to believe that the story of a life is very often just an inventory like this. Small physical objects that outlast every argument and every silence, and simply sit there, patient, waiting for someone brave enough to open the lid. There was Margaret's wedding ring, which she'd asked to be buried without, insisting instead that it come to me. So you've got something small enough to actually hold on to when the big things get too heavy. There was a photograph of the two of us on the courthouse steps the day we married, both of us laughing at something neither of us could remember years later. There was a lock of Vanessa's hair from her first haircut, tied with a faded blue ribbon, tucked into a small paper envelope. Margaret had labeled in her careful cursive, "Our girl, age 2, and beneath all of it, at the very bottom of the box, was a sealed envelope with a single word written across the front in Margaret's handwriting, a word that stopped my breath the moment I saw it: Vanessa. I did not open it that night, or the next. I sat with it on my nightstand for 4 more days. The way you sit with a repair you're afraid you don't have the steadiness in your hands to attempt yet. On the 5th night I finally opened it, and inside was a letter Margaret had written in the last month of her life, when the cancer had taken most of her strength but none of her clarity. A letter she had apparently written and sealed and never sent, and had instead given to me with instructions I had, in my own grief, somehow let slip entirely from memory. Instructions to give it to Vanessa. When the time is right, Walter, you'll know when. I read it once, alone, at my kitchen table, and I want to tell you honestly that I wept in a way I had not allowed myself to weep since the week of Margaret's funeral. Not the composed, private grief I permitted myself in small doses, but the full, ugly, shoulder-shaking kind, because in that letter Margaret had written the truest and most loving assessment of our daughter I had ever read, her pride in Vanessa's fierce intelligence, her worry, even 8 years ago, about the particular kind of man Vanessa seemed drawn to, men who measure a room before they've learned to sit still in it, her hope, stated plainly in the second-to-last paragraph, that whatever happened after she was gone, Vanessa would never let herself become so afraid of disappointing someone that she stopped being brave enough to tell the truth out loud. I read that letter 4 times that night, and I understood, with the same clean certainty I feel when I finally locate the one worn tooth, throwing off an entire gear train, exactly what I needed to do with it, and exactly when. The following week, my granddaughter Josie, Vanessa and Marcus's daughter, 7 years old, all elbows and unfiltered questions, came to my shop with her mother for what had, in recent months, become a rare visit. While Vanessa sat across the workbench from me discussing, in low, careful tones, what Renata Solis had found so far, Josie wandered the shop, the way she always does, nose an inch from the glass cases, narrating everything she saw to nobody in particular. She stopped in front of the Westminster clock I still hadn't tested, the one that had sat silent in my back room for over a year, and asked, "Grandpa, why does this one not get to tick like the others?" "It needs a repair I haven't finished," I told her, which was true in the way that half-truths are always technically true. She considered this with the total seriousness only a 7-year-old can bring to a small question. "You fix everybody's broken things," she said. "How come nobody ever fixes yours?" I did not have an answer for her. Vanessa, across the workbench, had gone very quiet, and when I looked up, her eyes were wet, and I understood that my granddaughter had just said, in 11 artless words, the exact thing neither Vanessa nor I had been able to say to each other in over a year. The inquiry into Marcus's business became public in the way these things always eventually do. Quietly at first, a small item in the business section of the local paper about irregularities under review at coal development, and then, over the following 6 weeks, less quietly, as two more investors came forward. Once the first article gave them the courage to admit what they'd already privately suspected. One of them was a retired schoolteacher named Ruth Alvarez, who had put a portion of her husband's life insurance payout into what Marcus had personally described to her as about as safe as real estate gets. Another was a young couple who had liquidated their wedding fund on Marcus's specific reassurance to get in early on what he'd called a sure thing. I want to be honest that when I learned the specifics of who Marcus had defrauded, something in me that had been holding steady through all of this, steady clinical diagnostic, finally cracked open into something closer to fury. Though I never let Marcus see it directly. I am not a man who raises his voice. But I understood, hearing Ruth Alvarez's name, understood down in the part of me that still remembers exactly how it felt to sit under a slow Westminster clock, counting the hours of my wife's dying, that this was no longer only about my daughter's marriage. It never had been, not really. It was about a man who had built an entire identity on taking things from people who trusted him and calling it ambition. The confrontation happened at Josie's 7th birthday party, of all places, 6 weeks into the public inquiry, in Vanessa and Marcus's backyard under a rented canopy strung with paper lanterns, 20 children running through a sprinkler while their parents stood in small clusters holding paper plates of cake. I had come because Josie asked me to, specifically, on the phone, in a voice too grown-up for 7 years old. "Please come, Grandpa. Mom needs you there even if she doesn't say it." Marcus arrived an hour late, visibly unraveled in the specific way a man unravels when the architecture of his own confidence has started sliding out from under him. His tie loosened, his laugh too loud, his eye contact too sustained, the particular overcompensation of someone running very fast through the dark while trying to look, to anyone watching, like he's simply out for a stroll. He found me near the drinks table, and I could tell from the set of his shoulders that he'd been building toward this conversation the entire drive over. "Walter," he said, too bright, "I understand you've been talking to some people." "I have," I said. "You understand what you're doing to this family, to Vanessa, to Josie." His voice dropped low enough that only I could hear it over the shrieking children and the sprinkler's hiss. "You understand that whatever petty grudge you're carrying about one comment at a party, it's going to cost your own daughter everything." I looked at this man, my son-in-law, standing in his rented backyard oasis paid for with money that did not belong to him, and I felt the same slow, deliberate stillness settle over me that had settled over me the night of that anniversary party, the uncoiling of a spring that had finally found its true resting position. "It wasn't a grudge, Marcus," I said. "It was a diagnosis, and you should know, better than anyone, that I don't pull a movement apart based on a feeling. I wait for the evidence to confirm what I already suspect." It confirmed it. Something shifted in his face, the exact split-second calculation I'd once watched cross another man's face on the deck of a boat I no longer thought about, though I'd heard the story once, second-hand, from a customer, and recognized something of myself in it. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Marcus said. And then, in the ugliest moment of that entire afternoon, he added, low and cutting, "Your wife would be embarrassed, watching you turn her granddaughter's birthday into a witch hunt over money you don't even understand." The canopy behind us went very quiet. In the specific way a group of adults goes quiet when they've overheard something they weren't meant to. I heard from somewhere behind me the particular strangled silence of my daughter, who had apparently walked up in time to hear the second half of that sentence. And then something happened that I had not expected, that changed the entire shape of that afternoon, and, I think now, the entire shape of the year that followed it. Vanessa stepped directly between us, in front of everyone, and said, in a voice loud enough to carry across the whole yard, cutting Marcus off mid-sentence in a way she had never once done to him in 9 years of marriage, "Don't you dare talk about my mother. Don't you dare stand in her mother's granddaughter's backyard and use her memory as a weapon against the one person who has never once lied to me about anything." Her hands were shaking. I could see them shaking from 6 feet away. "My father has cancer, Marcus. My father has cancer, and I told him in front of 40 people that I didn't have time for him, and I have hated myself every single day since I said it, And you know why I said it? Because you told me the week before that party that if I kept making a scene about driving him to appointments, it would look bad in front of your investors. You told me that. And I let you tell me that because I was terrified of what would happen to us if I didn't. And I am done. I am done being terrified of you. I want to tell you that the entire party erupted into applause, the way it might in a film, but that isn't what happened. What happened instead was quieter, and I think more real, a group of neighbors and coworkers and other parents standing in stunned silence for a long moment, and then, one at a time, without any of them exchanging a word, simply moving to stand near Vanessa. Ruth Alvarez's daughter, who it turned out lived 2 streets over, and had come to the party as a friend of another guest entirely unaware of the connection, was the first to step forward. Then Otto, who had come with me. Then 3 of Vanessa's own co-workers from the law firm, people I'd never met, who apparently had been quietly aware for months that something was wrong and had simply been waiting for permission to stand somewhere visible about it. Nobody said anything grand. They simply stood, a loose half-circle of people forming around my daughter without a word being spoken, the way a community gathers not because anyone asked it to, but because it had simply been waiting for the moment it was needed. Marcus left before the cake was cut. I heard his car pull out of the driveway too fast, the particular sound of a man who needs to feel like he's moving, even though he no longer has anywhere left to go. Everything after that moved with the peculiar mixture of speed and slowness that I've come to understand, is simply how consequences actually arrive in real life. Nothing like the tidy single-scene collapse of a movie villain. Marcus was charged 4 months later with wire fraud and securities violations. His firm was dissolved. He did not go to prison. His attorneys were skilled, and the plea agreement that resulted was, in its own way, a kind of prison anyway. A substantial restitution order, a lifetime prohibition from ever again managing investor funds, a public record that will follow him into every conversation he ever tries to have about his professional history for the rest of his life. Vanessa filed for divorce 2 weeks after Josie's birthday party, and Renata Solis, true to the promise she'd made in our very first phone call, made certain that nothing in Vanessa's name was touched by the collapse. The house, purchased before the fraud began, remained hers. Her own savings, carefully firewalled, the moment we'd first suspected trouble, remained untouched. I gave Vanessa Margaret's letter on a Sunday afternoon 4 months after the birthday party, sitting across from her at the same diner booth where we'd had our first real conversation about all of this. I did not explain what it was before I handed it to her. I simply set the envelope on the table between us and said, "Your mother wrote this for you 8 years ago. I should have given it to you a long time before now, and I'm sorry that I didn't." She opened it slowly, and I watched her read it, and I watched her hand come up to cover her mouth at the same paragraph that had undone me at my kitchen table months earlier, and when she finished, she folded it with the same careful precision her mother always used with anything that mattered, and she reached across the table and held my hand for a long time without saying anything at all. And I understood that whatever words either of us might have found in that moment would only have gotten in the way of the thing that was actually happening. "I want to keep working," she told me, weeks later, sitting on a bench outside my shop on a Saturday afternoon, watching Josie press her face against the window glass to look at the clocks. "I want to be good at my job without measuring every decision against someone else's approval first. I want Josie to grow up watching me tell the truth even when it costs something." She looked at me. "I want to learn what you do, Dad, the actual work. I want you to teach me if you'll have me at the bench." I told her the bench had room for exactly as many hands as were willing to be patient with it, and that hers were always welcome. 2 weeks before what would have been Margaret's 61st birthday, the community around Vine Street organized something I had no part in planning and did not find out about until Otto walked into my shop one Thursday evening, took me by the arm without much explanation, and led me 2 doors down, where he'd apparently been quietly hosting the whole thing in his own back room for a month. There, waiting, were Desmond and Ruth Alvarez, whom I had never actually met in person until that night, and 3 other customers whose watches I'd restored over the years, and Otto's nephew and Vanessa and Josie, and a small hand-painted sign that read, simply, Brennan's time. Every second accounted for continued. They had commissioned, without telling me, a scholarship fund in Margaret's name for young people in the neighborhood interested in learning a trade, seeded partly by donations and partly, Vanessa told me quietly, by a portion of her own settlement. Money, she said she wanted, to go towards something that builds instead of something that just sits in an account. Ruth Alvarez stood up in front of that small, crowded room and told a version of what had happened to her, and thanked, without knowing my name until that exact night, the person who apparently wouldn't let it go, and I stood in the back of that room with my hands in my pockets and felt something in my chest, finally, fully release. The last small tension I had been carrying since that anniversary party finding, at last, its true and permanent resting position. That night, walking home, I stopped at my shop, unlocked the door, and went to the back room where the Westminster clock had been sitting silent for over a year. I stood in front of it for a long time. Then I opened the case, checked the movement, wound it with steady hands, and set the pendulum swinging. It struck the quarter hour 12 minutes later. I stood and let the 4 descending notes fall the whole way through, all 4 of them, for the first time in 3 years without turning away, without my hands going still, without the old cold grip closing around my chest. When it finished, the shop was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one I'd been living inside for 3 years. Not an absence, but a room simply resting between one honest sound and the next. I am 62 years old. I am a watchmaker, the son of a watchmaker, and I have spent my whole life believing that anything built with enough patience will eventually, given time, tell the truth about itself. My daughter told the truth about herself in a backyard full of paper lanterns, in front of people who chose, without being asked, to stand beside her when it mattered. My son-in-law told the truth about himself on the deck of an anniversary party, and again in that same backyard, and both times the truth he told was the same one, just louder the second time. And I have learned, in the 2 years since a slow 4-note chime finally stopped frightening me, that the actual measure of a life well spent isn't whether you ever get struck by something that breaks you. It's whether, afterward, you're still willing to open the case, still willing to wind the spring, still willing to let the thing keep telling time. Every second accounted for. My father wrote that under our name 60 years ago, and I understand it now the way I never could as a young man in a hurry. It doesn't mean every second is perfect. It means every second gets acknowledged, honestly, exactly as it happened, and then the hands keep moving anyway. The shop is still on Vine Street. Vanessa comes on Saturdays now, and her hands, I'll admit, are getting steadier at the bench each month. Josie asks 100 questions every visit, and I answer every single one of them, because I've learned there's no such thing as too small a question when it's asked by someone who's actually listening for the answer. And some evenings, after the sign is flipped to closed, I sit at my father's old workbench with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, and I listen to the whole shop tick, a dozen restored clocks all keeping their own honest time, and I think about Margaret, and about a letter she trusted me to hold on to until the moment was right, and about how she was correct, the way she was almost always correct, that I would know exactly when that moment had finally come.